Thank you very much. It will be a very, very different presentation. Mine is very wordy, but I will try to not be too long. So maybe as Ella said, I didn't hear, but I'm not a researcher. I'm an engineer, so I'm not dealing about research, but about, let's say, the pipes of research. In this case, the publication. So my role, my mission is to try to develop books and journals supported by LAM in France, but also some French research institutes abroad in sub-Saharan Africa. If you're not familiar, it's research institutes that are located in Africa, but funded by French governments. And the peculiarity is that they are located and operated for non-Francophone African countries and regions. And we have developed journals like sources. There are older journals like Annales d'Éthiopie for Ethiopia or the East African Review. And recently, book imprints, Africa and CFE, French Center for Ethiopian Studies, and they are all in open access. So it's Diamond open access. Diamond means it's funded by institution and non-governmental funds, and it's not for profit. So the French research institutes abroad, so like the one in Africa, there are some in other parts of the world. They have a long tradition of publishing research through books and journals from the early 20th century, mostly in the first time in French. It was by the time that the French was struggling to have the French being the language of science that we have somewhat give up at some point. And after that, more and more, the language has been diversified. So you see books in English, in Spanish, from Latin America, in Portuguese or in Arabic. Authorship has been diversified as well, from French and European authorships to more mixed and African, Latin American / Middle Eastern authorships. And there was also an early shift to open access since the years 2000 for journals, then for books, knowing that the more open access movement is a bit more recent. So it's like 10 years earlier that the majority of other publishers, mostly in France. So I'm here in Nairobi to try to help to develop these book collections, mostly. And the particularity of African Research Institute, French Research Institute in Africa, is that they have set up co-publication policies with a lot of publishers, depending of the regions. And so we are not doing by ourselves books, but we are dealing with regional publishers. So I counted 16 publishers or potential publishers who can co-produce books with us, and I have met 14 publishers in different countries, and that's what I will talk about for the most part. But first, there is some question I have to address, and I had to address to myself before beginning to do this work this year. What is the landscape of open access books in African studies? Have they really an impact on African societies? Because we are funded to do open access book, it is really relevant. Why is the open access book made in Africa? And the fourth question that try to address the question of this morning. So first of all, I will try to do that, but it's important on my point of view that the open access for books in African studies and books about Africa in general is very, very limited. So I counted about 2% of all the books that are produced are in open access, which means 800 per year, because there is a lot of books produced all around the world. My source here is WorldCat, so the catalog of the library catalogs around the world. So it's very few books compared to all the books, and they are mostly published in Europe and Northern America. And they are funded either by institutions like universities, but also foundations, or they are commercial, meaning that we ask the author to pay to open up their books. So it's around 50-50. 50 book, open access book published by university presses and 50% books published by private companies like Routledge, James Curry. You know them. Are there open access books produced in Africa? There are some, but very few. I estimated about 5% of all the open access books produced about Africa. So it's 5% out of the 2%, which means like 1 or 2 titles out of 1,000 titles published per year about African issues. And it has been mentioned, there is an exception in South Africa that mostly all these publishers are from South Africa, except Cottesria, which is located in Senegal, but in fact, which is a transnational or international publisher. Second question, we see there is a few books, so is it even relevant to have open access on African studies? So those who I have discussed with know this kind of stats, but yes, I think it is quite documented that books on the global south or the South, Africa, Latin America, etc., are widely read and widely, proportionally, most read than the other books. I can try to unfold that later, but we see, for example, I took the example of the Open Edition platform because I have the stats, that's the reason. And we see that from all the books on literature topic that are published in English, the most read is the one about oral literature in Africa. Of all the books, among all the books published in English about politics, the most read is about Nigeria, etc., etc. In French, the most viewed book on political science is Introduction à la politique africaine. And we can also prove that the views come from African countries, mostly. So it's not just random consultation. You see the one from IFRA Nigeria collection, from Africae, which is mostly read in Eastern Africa, and IRD edition, which is read at the same time in Africa and in Latin America. So, very sorry, it's too wordy, but just my conclusion is that the overwhelming majority of open access books in African are published in northern countries. They are overwhelmingly in English. Like 95% of these open access books are in English, very few are in French, and I saw no book in African languages. So not only are they in English, but they are dealing with the English-speaking regions of Africa, Southern Africa, English, Western Africa, and Eastern Africa. And the authors are mainly not Africans, but Northern Anglophones from US, UK, etc. Or they are African colleagues, but working in Anglophone university, mostly in that northern countries. And 90% of all the African authors that I saw publishing in open access are from Anglophone country. And once again, the only exception among these empire of the North is the South Africa. So the other question is there hidden open access books in Africa? So I crawled through the world catalogs, but maybe there are like hidden books on other networks, etc. So my answer, after I've been there for several months and try to find it, is that probably absolutely not, because there is just no economy, no business model, no way of producing books in open access locally here. The university are absolutely not favorizing open access books, contrary to open access journal. And there is a few authors of books in Africa for contextual reason that they are really not pushed to publish books. But, and I have an example here. There is a lot of photo, it's a bit messy, and it's not about East Africa, but the most striking example also is about Nigeria, but University of Ibadan. And we see from the field that just a lot of book academic publishers are just disappeared. They are just being destroyed along the wave of structural adjustments. We see in libraries, the fewer books, the recent we try to find them, and in bookshops as well. And I heard Ella speaking about nostalgia of the 70s and 80s when there was forum or conversation between Africa and Europe. And we have lost that with the lack of funding of African university, but we have not only lost intellectual richness, but we have lost skills in publishing research in Africa. So, and the paradox is there is no open access books, or very few, but there is a lot of open access publications in Africa. And there is a large movement of publishing in open access, but it's not concerning books. There is open access repository where you can find a lot of PhD dissertation, master dissertation. There is a lot of technical reports, research reports, working papers, governmental, NGOs, etc. There is a lot of open access journals, partly what we call predatory journals here, and sometimes regional journals published in university that we don't know or we hardly know. There are books, but they are not in open access, and they are sometimes self-edited, etc., etc. So there are a lot of contents, which is not, the particularity is not the kind of context we see in bibliography in the North. So I put these strange drawings, and I try to see that the African studies content published in Africa is more like a mangrove-like publications. We see all the roots, like we see all the bibliography because it's on open access, because there is no a lot of libraries behind them. And published in the North, there is these kind of flowers or plants with a lot of roots which are hidden in libraries and bookshops, which are reachable by northern academics, but not for southern academic for the most part. So that's the paradox I come to, and that was quite sad, but I have to admit this, that's the open access movement now, as it is, spontaneously maintain position and even strengthen position of strength in publishing world and in the academic world, and is renewing inequalities in the production of academic books, in the authorships, in the readability of academics from the north or from the south, and it's also strengthening inequalities within Africa, between regions of Africa. So it's a problem we have to address, and I think it revealed the strong enclosures in social science and humanity. In fact, we try to think about it for 5 minutes. It's not a big surprise regarding the high cost of having and supporting social science and humanities academic world in a country. And when it's my hypothesis, but I can try to defend, it's even worse in social science and humanities than in STM regarding to inequalities of access to producing knowledge. So we are not trying to despair, and we're trying to find fair ways to publish African studies in open access. So from a few years, that's why we try to do with the journal and with the books. So try to promote multilingualism. We see that the problem is the distortion in language. So not only English, but French and Portuguese, and also African language. We try to open up the authorship and the reviewership, I can say like that, of the books and journals, promoting big continental projects, and considering more the African references as legitimate reference within research text. But I see two risks with doing that, what I called a bit widely neo-extractivism, that being more inclusive with African authors can lead to have them publish in a European context more than in an African context. And when it comes to books, as I say, unfair competition with the regional publishers that I tried to mention, they have no access to fundings for this open access dissemination. So the second step is to try to do that with not replacing African publishers and not trying to make the landscape being worse. So from my point of view, there is two bad solutions, like suspending the OA, not publishing in OA since the other African publisher can do that, because it will mean to the good old extractivism that we are publishing books that are not accessible in Africa. Excluding the African authors, African language, which is even worse. So the only reasonable solution is try to partner with African book publisher, African university, who can support with us publications. And it's a bit of a tinkering, in fact, right now, on each deal, on each project, with each publisher, to try to have fair way of partner on each book by sharing the editorial concept of this book, by at some time slowing down our open access outputs to delay it, to enable the partners to monetize the digital copies of the print copies, and sharing our fundings with other publishers. But it's not really satisfying at some points, and in the future, and what we are trying to work on it is to joint application for grant with our partner here, and more deeply advocate for that the books that are funded upon Africa should have, if possible, African-based publisher as an output. And the other thing we were trying to do is technological transfer, the good old technology transfer, but in terms of publishing skills. And the photo represents a training session set in a university. And what has been interesting, we have designed this training session with the professors and with the press of this Kenyan university, Moi University. And it was about open source publishing tools. And you see professional librarians and students in master in publishing here. Because not only the question is to have open access, because that's a wish, but strong open access and sustainable open access, and really visible open access. Because the question of open access, it's not only whether it's restricted or it's open access, but is it open access, but it is sustainable, and is it really readable? But the other conclusion is, as journals and books, we still publish very few African texts. I saw some stats for the different series in Africa books and in journals as well for sources. So the first one, which is well addressed in there, is an effect of gatekeeping. It's not easy for African authors to publish in European journals, but I think mostly, and it's maybe less addressed, that we have to admit that we are not really attractive for the interesting text in African studies from African authors. Because for books and even for journals, and I can explain that later, we don't offer revenues, but we also don't offer as reputation as a US or UK-based publisher can offer. And I have this example that I found recently, that this like epitome of books of decolonial alternative epistemology books published by Nigerian authors on Springer. And not only it's not in open access, but you see that the books cost like 130 euros and the ebook 100 euros. And I think it's kind of understandable. There is no time for OA in this academic competition. It's time for legitimate these topics and this issue in the first world of science, as I said it, which is US and UK orientated. And I saw that I'm concluding in 2 minutes. I saw that also in prominent, I say, flagged as decolonial or alternative epistemological center in South Africa, like the one in Wits University or its University of Cape Town, that open access, it's not really the main agenda now. I can suspect there is a two-time strategy. First, having proper books published in the most reputational publishers, and having an open access collection, which is slightly developed, but it's not the main goal. So you see that even in this prominent decolonial center, they are published in very traditional publishers and northern publishers, and the language of publication is really widely English. So if there are dead ends, trying to go a bit further, the question is, how can we support the production of scientific literature that is compatible with the reduction of epistemic injustice? And there are some maybe just rabbit holes, but interesting one, that we can here address the blind spots of research dissemination. And there is an example that we have to, that I realized, that we have not competitors of publishing translation into Portuguese of open access books on the Portuguese-speaking world in Africa, mostly here, Angola and Mozambique. The other thing we can do is to support and co-conceptualize programs like this one in University of Dar es Salaam last year, co-supported by IFRA Nairobi. And we are thinking of producing a book in Kiswahili about this slavery and post-slavery in modern African history program. The words in Kiswahili say exactly the same thing, because it doesn't exist any other possible input now for open access books in Kiswahili. Yes, it's a bit too much, I admit, but I think we still have to produce information about the landscape of open access publication in Africa, and we need to work on more solid criteria of judging the level of fairness of the open access in African studies. And that's the thing that I have to learn this last year, partly thanks to the seminar, that we are still a bit weak in knowing if what we are doing is really fair or have some side effects that are not really desirable. And I come again to this image, and that's for me now the main problem, is that the mingling of text from the South, as they are written and there they are conceived now in this situation, and the open access publication are they wanted to be in Europe, that we don't want just to have open access publication, but we want to legitimate ourselves with the best way to do it. So I see, Ella, maybe you are a bit stressed, so I shut it.
Merci beaucoup. Merci de nous remettre en cause aussi nos certitudes sur l'open access comme voie royale, de nous rappeler comment l'open access du Nord sur le Sud reconduit en réalité des injustices épistémiques préexistantes, et aussi à l'intérieur du continent. Merci pour toutes les pistes que tu essaies de mettre en place en termes de co-partenariat avec des éditeurs africains, et en termes de multilinguisme, on y croit vraiment très fort. Tu es par ailleurs derrière la revue Source aussi, donc tu as aussi tout cet empan pratique. On tenait énormément à ton apport sur le côté technique, pour mettre aussi en regard les grands discours qu'on pourrait avoir et qu'on pourrait tenir. Voilà. Moi, je discute avec toi depuis longtemps, donc est-ce que dans la salle, il y a des rebonds,
Bon, trois questions très brèves. Pour tempérer un peu ton pessimisme, est-ce que tu ne penses pas que l'open access simplement reproduit la situation d'inégalité? Est-ce que tu crois vraiment qu'elle la renforce en plus de la reproduire? Deuxième question, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas un problème? Je n'ai pas l'impression qu'on en ait parlé avec les moteurs de recherche. Trouver justement toutes ces publications venant des universités ou de différentes sources africaines, lorsque on met une question en recherche sur bon, je ne veux pas dire sur Google ou sur n'importe quel autre moteur de recherche, est-ce qu'il y a un site qui recense ces différentes sources d'open access en Afrique? Troisième question, ça c'est pas une question pour toi, c'est une question pour tout le monde, et c'est une question pour les gens qui ne sont pas retraités comme moi. Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas un combat beaucoup plus ferme à mener pour le changement des modes d'évaluation des publications dans l'université, et en particulier dans l'université française, pour qu'on prenne en compte les publications en open access comme aussi valables, notamment lorsqu'elles sont faites dans des supports comme Source où il y a une véritable évaluation? Est-ce que ça, c'est pas une bagarre à mener dans les instances directrices du CNRS et de l'université? So, very basically, I mean, my first question was, do you think that open access really reinforce or just reproduce the inequalities of publication in publication from African authors and African publishing houses? Second question, is there not a problem with research engines on the internet that makes it very difficult to find African authors and African sources of publication? And is there not one particular website that would give the address of all the open access publishing systems in Africa? And the third question concerns basically French academia, so I don't think I need to translate that.
Et pas seulement des films aussi, enfin des films de Chloé.
Oui, mais ça aussi, c'est
au-delà de ça.
Il n'y a pas que l'écrit dans ce qui rend compte de la recherche et ce qui permet de faire circuler les résultats de recherche. Et ça, bon, alors là, le côté film, bon, je ne suis pas regardé là-dessus pendant des années.
Je pense qu'on peut documenter que ça ne fait pas que répéter, mais que ça renforce et que ça aggrave beaucoup les inégalités pour différentes raisons. La différence entre un livre en accès ouvert et un livre pas en accès ouvert, c'est un lectorat de 1 à 100 ou de 1 à 1000. Donc, il y a un effet très clair et un effet en termes de citation aussi. On sait bien que même pour les chercheurs au Nord, un article en accès ouvert va être beaucoup plus lu et cité qu'un article en revue, même si la revue a un abonnement dans la bibliothèque de l'université. Donc déjà, il y a une réelle différence en termes de lectorat potentiel. Et donc, avant, on publiait des livres, on publiait en papier, puis on se débrouillait pour les faire circuler. Maintenant, il faut les publier en électronique et c'est plus compliqué, contrairement à ce que d'aucuns peuvent penser. C'est plus compliqué, c'est plus cher, parce que maintenir une infrastructure numérique, c'est très cher, en fait. Et par exemple, en Europe, pour ce qu'on appelle l'accès ouvert diamant, la France et plus largement l'Europe via l'ERC a mis énormément de fonds, en fait, pour mobiliser et développer cet accès ouvert, dont n'ont accès en leur écrasante majorité que les chercheurs européens. Et aux États-Unis, il y a moins d'accès ouvert qu'en Europe, mais il est rendu possible par des universités qui ont un certain budget ou par des fondations, comme par exemple la fondation Mellon, qui soutient beaucoup de recherche en accès ouvert. Et les factures pour publier en accès ouvert chez des éditeurs privés sont, vous le savez peut-être, en gros entre 8 000 et 12 000 euros. Publier un livre, ça coûte 8 000 et 12 000 euros, qui est pris en charge soit par les universités, soit par des fondations privées. Autant dire que, hormis l'Afrique du Sud, personne en Afrique ne peut s'offrir un budget pareil, surtout sur le fait que le livre est conçu toujours pour rapporter de l'argent et pas pour payer pour pouvoir publier en général. Voilà, donc, et ça se voit en fait, le constat le plus clair, c'est qu'il n'y a que l'Afrique du Sud qui a eu la surface économique nécessaire pour créer un monde en accès ouvert, et c'est pas, alors ça dépend des pays, mais c'est pas parce que les autres pays sont contre le fait d'avoir des jolies plateformes en accès ouvert, c'est que ça coûte extrêmement cher en termes techniques et logistiques. Voilà, et même l'Afrique du Sud, en termes de livres, même s'il y a des importantes ambitions d'être visible, on voit que ça reste assez timide parce que c'est pas si facile que ça à financer du tout, en fait. Et donc, voilà. Première chose. Alors, où trouver des ressources en accès ouvert africaines? C'est toute la question. C'est compliqué, c'est un peu de moins en moins compliqué. Mais la question qui m'avait été posée par mes collègues de OAPEN, c'est une organisation qui s'occupe du développement de l'accès ouvert des livres dans le monde, en fait, n'arrivait pas à trouver vraiment des livres en accès ouvert africains. Et ils m'ont demandé, est-ce que tu as des pistes? Et c'est là où je me suis dit, les amis, en fait, il y en a vraiment pas beaucoup. Pour le format livre, justement, il y a beaucoup de ressources en accès ouvert qu'on trouve, notamment les thèses et les masters. Alors, c'est peut-être particulièrement vrai pour l'Afrique de l'Est anglophone, qui est peut-être de meilleures infrastructures numériques que l'Afrique de l'Ouest francophone, mais maintenant, la plupart des universités ont un genre de hall local. Alors, la différence, c'est qu'il y a très peu de centralisation nationale ou régionale. C'est vraiment université par université, un peu sur le modèle anglo-américain, là encore, qu'on trouve les ressources. Et si ça t'intéresse, si ça vous intéresse, il y a en gros un répertoire de tous les archives ouvertes dans le monde où on peut voir si en Ouganda, au Kenya, au Zimbabwe, on peut trouver des petits halls, des petites archives ouvertes de ci, de là. Et elles sont très, très inégalement remplies. Comme j'ai déjà dit, celui de l'University of Nairobi, c'est le plus important d'Afrique avec pas loin de 75 000 documents qu'on peut trouver dedans, essentiellement de la littérature grise et de la littérature universitaire. Des fois, c'est quelques centaines, c'est quelques milliers, voilà, on ne sait pas trop ce qu'on trouve. Mais de plus en plus, et ça va assez vite en fait, il y a des initiatives de structuration de ce monde-là, notamment une qui s'appelle Africa Archive, avec un grand X, qui essaye de monter à une sorte de méta-infrastructure de contenu en accès ouvert, que ça soit des données, des publications ou de la littérature grise universitaire.
Est-ce que tu
Et
peux répondre à
ensuite, sur les modes...
Voilà, en 2 minutes,
Oui,
parce qu'on doit passer.
voilà.
Désolée, Bastien.
Et je m'arrête. Sur les modes d'évaluation, bah, je suis forcément tout à fait d'accord qu'il faudrait un petit peu changer sur les modes d'évaluation. Et le fait aussi que les sciences humaines et sociales sont vraiment très dépendantes économiquement, c'est que, enfin, c'est ce qui frappe le plus en tant qu'éditeur, pas seulement en études africaines, mais dans d'autres, c'est le poids de l'économie et le poids du marketing de l'édition académique, en fait. Enfin, je ne vais pas vous l'apprendre, mais euh, tout le monde dans la salle préfère publier chez Cambridge University Press.
Merci une fois.
Voilà, c'est
On
très
va
bien. Hein.
on va terminer. Merci à toi. On reviendra si on a le temps dans un dernier échange, mais là, le temps est un peu contraint parce qu'on s'est laissé aller. Mais merci, Bastien, merci.